right. All right. Looks like we are live as far as I can tell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I hope that you're having a lovely evening. And we are here this Sunday evening to do a little bit of history, to do a little bit of a study of geopolitics. And we're looking to try and make sense of our present situation today. The world of politics, especially at the level of paradigm, is increasingly toxic, I would say. And I think that oftentimes in these situations, what's helpful is for us to take a step back and to get a bigger picture. And in my understanding, achieving that bigger picture usually involves some sort of historical precedent for us to observe and make sense of. And so we're going to be doing that tonight. If you haven't seen the show before, this is Living in the Logos. My name is Ryan Tower. I'm very grateful for you to be here. If you're seeing this live or if you're seeing this at a later date, I appreciate and value your attention. I know that time is a very valuable commodity in our day. And yeah, I just want to say I'm grateful that you would choose to be here for a moment and do some learning with me. So we are normally doing philosophy, theology, a little bit of history, geopolitics, and a little bit of pop culture stuff. This is only the third installment, so I have plenty of material to work through. I just have been noticing recently the divisiveness in the political arena. And I suppose I'll start by sharing a little bit of a background of how I came into this kind of understanding of how the world works. And when I was 17, 18 years old, I really wanted to get an understanding of how the world works. I've always been interested in things like that. And so I had a friend who had a community access media TV show here in Manchester, New Hampshire, where I live. And he invited me onto the TV show to basically just be a guest. And I think he did it more as a way to encourage me to become interested, to learn to articulate my thoughts and ideas in a more coherent way, which I'm super grateful for to this day. It had a huge impact on my life. But what happened that evening is on live TV, my face turned red. I had no idea what to say or what I thought about anything. And I realized that night when I went home that my life previous to that moment, I didn't really have any opinions or ideas that I felt that I had garnered on my own or through research and study on an individual basis. I just kind of realized that I was sort of just a kind of a copy, a molded form of the present cultural ideas. And that really bothered me. And so from that moment, I began studying philosophy, especially. But at that time, it was more geared towards the world of politics, because in my youthful understanding of the world, my impression was that if one were active enough, committed enough to, work in the realms of politics, that you could affect a positive change on the world and the people around you. And so that was where I began. And also at the community access media TV station, one of the producers there asked me if I was interested in politics. I said, until now, not really, but yes, I am now. And he said, oh, that's great. And he handed me one of those stacks of CDs, one of those mini CD towers. And all of the documentaries on the towers were all sorts of, different ideas about the banking system, about geopolitics, and, conspiracy theory kind of realm of ideas and stuff. And so I went through pretty much all of those documentaries in a few days. And from then on, I've kind of had this desire to make sense of the world, especially the ways in which power operates, the ways in which our lives as a community are shaped by the peoples whose influence we are subject to. And so that was the beginning of my foray into geopolitics. And since then, I've obviously done a lot more studying, that being something like, 13 years ago. So yeah, I've learned a lot, and I'm hoping I can share some of these little nuggets of knowledge that I've gleaned from spending time in these books. And the book that we're looking at today is a mainstay in the geopolitical world. It is called Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. And the reason why, well, it's a twofold implication really why this book is important. One of the reasons that it's important is because Carroll Quigley was an influential historian of his time. He was a graduate of Harvard. He was a professor at Georgetown University, and by no small means, he influenced the majority of geopolitical thinking in that generation of politicians that kind of grew up under his teaching. One of those, most importantly, would be somebody like Bill Clinton. You can find the clips where Bill Clinton thanks Carroll Quigley for being his mentor and for really shaping his political ideas. And so Carroll Quigley was a participant of the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you don't know what the Council on Foreign Relations is, we're going to learn about all that, so don't worry about it. But the point being that Carroll Quigley is an influential historian because, one, he influenced politicians that now influence us, and two, he had access to historical sources that a traditional academic historian would not necessarily have access to. And so if you do a little bit of reading about Tragedy and Hope, the book that we're going to be studying in today, there's a lot of kind of myth and spooky stories surrounding the actual plates. And, the myth goes that Carroll Quigley revealed too much in the book, and there was some attempts at suppressing its release and things. And I don't want to get caught up in all of the mythological aspects of how the book was created or who Carroll Quigley is as a person or what he was involved with. I want mainly to deal with the content of the book, because I feel as though that's really going to give us a informed way of viewing the world and the way that it functions today. And so the history covers about 1859 or 1895 to 1950. So if you know even just a little bit of history, which I would imagine you might, you would realize that a lot of really significant world events occurred during that big span of history. Things like the Depression, world wars, and these events have a profound impact on how we interact with the world and politics at large. And so Carroll Quigley is giving us a peek into the minds and sources of information that actually shaped those world events. So we're going to be getting a look into the minds of the people who shape our culture today. And in a lot of ways, the same geopolitical strategy that was written about by Carroll Quigley in this book is still functioning to the present time. And so, historian, we know he's a Harvard grad, a professor at Georgetown, but we need to ask ourselves about the title first and foremost. So, Tragedy and Hope, a history of the world in our time. The tragedy in the title, Carroll Quigley is referring to the two world wars, which were absolutely devastating in terms of their violence, in terms of their impact on the psychology of Europe and the West. And hope, in Carroll Quigley's worldview, is the ability that we have still to spread what he would call classical liberalism. And so classic liberalism is going to be different than the progressive liberalism that we have today. So that's something to keep in mind. And we're not going to get too bogged down on definitions and stuff, because mainly what we want to look at in this first, I think we're going to cover, we'll get through as much as we can, maybe the first 2 chapters this evening. And what I'm going to try and do is get to the real foundations of the ideas without getting too bogged down in all of the historical details, because this is a serious text. We're talking somewhere around 1,000 pages, and the amount of detail that Carroll Quigley achieved in this book is absolutely incredible. And he actually apologizes in the preface about how long it was, which is and in some cases it's helpful. In other cases, it's really daunting and can be rather boring to read through. But that's why I'm here. So now you guys, you don't have to read this 960-page book. You can just tune into the YouTube channel, and you're going to get all of the little gems of information that Carroll Quigley revealed to us without having to spend 20 to 40 hours reading the book. And so there's a couple things that I do want to mention before we get into this. And ultimately, Carroll Quigley, speaking on his worldview, Carroll Quigley believed that the aims and purposes of the wealthy globalist elite, he believed in their cause. So he's writing this book as an apologetic, defending the worldview, which we would today classify as globalist, right? So he believed that the intentions of the global elite in trying to formulate and create an international government was the hope of the future. And so that's where the hope comes from tragedy and hope. What Carroll Quigley is ultimately saying is that out of the chaos of history, we are going to be formatting and creating a hope for the future, which is in general terms an end of national sovereignty and kind of the individual nations succumbing themselves to a global government. Now, if you have spent any time on the internet, you might have heard conspiracy theories about world government, about the New World Order. All of these catchphrases are popular on the internet, and they are, in a functional sense, they are true. There has been this vein of thinking that goes back to, at the very least, to the foundations of the banking system in the 1800s, in the Industrial Revolution. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, the Rothschild family. These are real historical characters that exercised a great deal of influence on the building of the world that we now live in. And now what they said back then is still true today. They pursue the same goals, they believe and adhere to the same worldview that they did back then, the generations that come after them. And so ultimately, Carroll Quigley wrote this book as an apologetic in defense of that worldview. Okay, so we have to keep in mind that maybe you might agree with him. I don't personally agree with his worldview. I don't believe in the idea of having a global government. I don't believe in the idea of sacrificing the sovereignty of individual nations to this higher order of organization across the world. And so it's important that we know we can still get good information out of a historical book that we don't necessarily agree with. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't endorse Carroll Quigley's worldview. Just because we're covering this book, we're not saying that we agree. All right. And that's important because you're going to see as we go through the text, there's some really fundamental differences between a worldview that somebody like myself adheres to and the worldview that Carroll Quigley does. And as we see that this is ultimately an apologetic for the global elite, we're actually going to get very specific details on who played certain roles at what time, what they believed, what they were doing. And all of these things are very important if we want to get a better understanding of our present cultural moment. Okay. So we have today, if you turn on the news, if you follow current events on the internet in any significant fashion, then you will hear the media saying things like, the world has never been more divided than it is today. American politics has never been so divided, right? Now, discounting the fact that there's been a civil war, we can probably say that there's an element of truth in that. There is a, what would you say, a digging in our heels on each side of the political spectrum. So the left is becoming increasingly progressively liberal, extremist, and the right is becoming increasingly conservative, extremist as well. And what happens usually in these situations is that we start to alienate the average person who normally exists somewhere in between these extremes of the political spectrum. And so in these times, what I've found helpful and reasonable to do is to take a step back, to look at not just the left and the right paradigm, but to look at the historical precedent that's got us into this moment that we're in now. And so Carroll Quigley gives us a good opportunity to do that. And so we're going to see in the book the movers and shakers that establish the geopolitical worldview of the powers that be in the West. All right. We're going to see people like the Round Table Group. We're going to see people like Cecil Rhodes, who created the Round Table Group. We're going to see and hear about the fundamental banking families that created the banking system as we know it today. And we're going to get a detailed picture about really how those events formed and then shaped the future which we now live in. So Carroll Quigley finished this book in the early 1960s. Arguably, he probably would have been interested to see how things turn out. So we have obviously the benefit of hindsight, being in the future and looking back into the past. But generally speaking, I just wanted to mention it's an apologetic for the global elite. We don't necessarily endorse his views, but there is a lot of value in the work of history that he's given to us. And so we're going to start with kind of a broad overview. The first two chapters are an introduction to Western civilization in its world setting, Western civilization to 1914. And so those are the first two chapters, something like 50 pages. And I mean, a good majority of it we can probably breeze through a little bit. I would like to read the introductory paragraph though, because I think it'll really set the context for what it is that we're doing. So he says on the first page, "There have always been men who have asked where are we going, but never, it would seem, have there been so many of them. And surely never before have these myriads of questioners asked their question in such dolorous tones or rephrased their question in such despairing words, can man survive? Even on a less cosmic basis, questioners appear on all sides, seeking meaning or identity, or even on the most narrowly egocentric basis, trying to find myself." So you can see that this really sets the stage for what it is that we're trying to achieve by reading the book, but also I think what the book does ultimately deliver is where are things headed and where did they come from? And that's what we're looking to learn. So he mentioned some of the historians and cultural academics of history, and generally he's sort of putting before us now the lens through which he's going to be looking at the evolution of civilizations and kind of what it's been noticed throughout history when people study civilizations that they tend to go through a similar path, right? And so he's going to highlight kind of how that path works and what characteristics it has. So he says, from this discussion has emerged a fairly general agreement that men live in separately organized societies, each with its own distinct culture, that some of these societies, having writing and city life, exist on a higher level of culture than the rest and should be called by the different term civilizations, in quotes, and that these civilizations tend to pass through a common pattern of experience. And so you can get an idea of what that common experience is. The civilization is born in some inexplicable fashion. It has a slow start, enters a period of vigorous expansion. Gradually, there's some crisis of organization that appears, and oftentimes it's not able to reconcile itself to the crisis that emerges, and this ends up spreading out its value. It loses its morality and identity, and eventually is either conquered or is absorbed kind of into a civilization growing up near it. What Carroll Quigley is going to say that's interesting to us is that Western civilization didn't pass from this age of crisis into an age of universal empire, which was the common pattern. You could maybe make the case that we're reaching that stage now, but not quite yet. But he explains that instead of going into the age of universal empire, it was able to reorganize itself into another age of expansion. And so this is unique to Western civilization in Carroll Quigley's mind. And I think that's important to note, because there is something unique about Western civilization that sets it apart. Historically speaking, obviously we have a lot in common with civilizations of times past, but there is something unique about the West that hasn't occurred quite in the same way, as far as we know, in history. So that's pretty much all I wanted to get to from the introduction. We're really just thinking, how is it that we look at the evolution of civilization? How is it that they change? What are those phases? And the majority of the introduction is basically explaining how it is that Western civilization got to where it is today. We're going to be hearing about things like the agricultural revolution. What are the different factors inside of the course of the evolution that made Western civilization so powerful, that gave it the ability to reorganize itself into another age of expansion rather than collapsing. So we get some data on the agricultural revolution in 1725. We get a little bit of information about how the population grew, the different evolutions and revolutions in weapons, which Carroll Quigley finds to be very important. The ability for civilizations to develop means of defending themselves or attacking other nations or civilizations is highly important. And ultimately, let's see, what can we do here? So ultimately, we get to the philosophical underpinnings, which I think is going to be important for us to understand. And Carroll Quigley goes on to describe what kind of philosophical thrust was marking the 19th century, especially in the West. And so we've got 8 categories here, and these are the instances where you're going to see a difference in what my philosophical outlook would be and what Carroll Quigley's is, as far as I can tell. He says the 19th century was marked by 1, belief in the innate goodness of man. Okay. 2, secularism. 3, belief in progress. 4, liberalism. 5, capitalism. 6, faith in science. 7, democracy. And 8, nationalism. And in general, he says these 8 factors went along together in the 19th century. They were generally regarded as being compatible with one another. The friends of one were generally the friends of the others, and the enemies of one were generally the enemies of the rest. Metternich and de Maistre were generally opposed to all 8. People like Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill were generally in favor of all 8. So there's one thing that we should probably comment on. We, in my worldview, in my understanding of the world, something like secularism and faith in science, especially, these are going to be really problematic when you start to think of the metaphysical categories that allow us to make sense of the world. And this is no fault of Carroll Quigley's, because this is, the emergence of secularism, which Carroll will go on to explain is what was really at the roots of the French Revolution and the independence movement in the West. These ideas, I've been told multiple times that this is just like some kind of conspiracy, that you believe that faith in science and secularism were responsible for things like the French Revolution. But we get it right in here. It's very clear that Carroll Quigley had that same understanding. And so there's something about liberalism that we should take note of here as well. And I think he describes it really well. And this is kind of the thrust of those 8 philosophical commitments that come together to make this worldview. And what you get out of that worldview, Carroll Quigley really nails. And he says, if only man could be freed, they felt, freed from the corruption of society and its artificial conventions, freed from the burden of property, of the state, of the clergy, and of the rules of matrimony, then man, it seemed clear, could rise to heights undreamed of before, could indeed become a kind of Superman, practically a god. It was this spirit which set loose the French Revolution. It was this spirit which prompted the outburst of self-reliance and optimism so characteristic of the whole period, from 1770 to 1914. So you can see that this liberal thrust it's a little bit different than what we would imagine liberalism today, but it is nonetheless present. Okay. He goes on to say, obviously, if man is a godlike creature whose ungodlike actions are due only to the frustrations of social conventions, there is no need to worry about service to God or devotion to any other worldly end. Man can accomplish most by service to himself and devotion to the goals of this world. Thus came the triumph of secularism. So now, this evolution of thought is very important for somebody like myself, because I can see, if you had seen the last video that we did about transcendental arguments, there's some serious philosophical problems in the idea that humans are capable in a godlike fashion to craft their future and to make a world for themselves without God that would be functional, coherent, and organized. Now, there's nothing wrong in the Christian worldview with science. There's nothing wrong with having a belief in progress. But all those things happen inside of a philosophical system that can account and give justification for the worldview itself. Things like truth and beauty and logic, all of those things fit into a specific way of seeing the world that can be justified. And so you can see now the way that the world looks now, where you have secularism has really it's riding out to its logical conclusion, which is what it is: the absence of commitment to gender. It's basically an unscientific and ultimately a counter and contrary spiritual worldview to that of the Christian ethics and morals that got it to where it is now. So we're seeing the results now of these 8 categories being drawn to their logical conclusions, and this is going to spell trouble for civilization in the West. If people like Jordan Peterson, who you see making an attempt in a secular way to reconcile that worldview with the Bible, in my opinion, unsuccessfully, but you can see that there is an awareness that we've kind of turned our backs on something that's fundamental to how we viewed the world in prior generations. And, I think that there's going to be some issues with that. And I'm hoping and praying, of course, that we can come to an understanding that the world without God is not a world that we want to live in. Now, you might not like organized religion. You might think that it's goofy or childish, or you might think that ignorant people need to believe in God in order to make themselves feel safe or comfortable. But however you feel about it is irrelevant if the philosophy doesn't check out. And unfortunately for the secular worldview, we're learning now that things like subjectivism and relativism don't really work as a foundation to build a culture which is coherent and organized. And so we're seeing the results of that now. So to the 19th century mind, evil or sin was a negative conception. It merely indicated a lack, or at most a distortion of good. Any idea of sin or evil as a malignant positive force opposed to good and capable of existing by its own nature was completely lacking in the typical 19th century mind. To such a mind, the only evil was frustration and the only sin, repression. And so I wanted to point that out because it's interesting in terms of, there is some sense in the biblical worldview that sin is actually an aberration of good. And I do believe that the Bible describes to us a worldview in which in some sense, the nature of man is good, and that evil, the introduction of death and evil into the world in terms of anthropology, is actually it's a fall. It's a fall from the original nature of the garden. And so if it is that the fall introduces an unnatural circumstance and nature of humanity into the world, that to me makes more sense out of the presence of evil in the world. And so that's something that I found interesting. So he goes on to say that liberalism was the crop which emerged from the soil, those 8 categories that we mentioned before. And it said, in its broadest aspect, liberalism believed that men should be freed from coercive power as completely as possible. And this is where you get the tradition of laissez-faire, all these kind of ideas. They developed this idea of a community of interests where they, in their kind of utopian idea of how things would work, they thought that without the authority, without the structure, the coercive power structure, that people with mutual interests would work out in a community where they would recognize the benevolence of how they treated each other, and that things would kind of organically develop into a system of common interest, which they learned really quickly that wasn't the case. And there's one other aspect of this that I thought was interesting, where Quigley mentions that liberalism, the community of interest, and the belief in progress led almost inevitably to the practice and theory of capitalism. And so you can see, when you imagine this organization of people organically interacting with each other based on their common interests, when you add the exchange of value into that equation, and when you think that there should always be progress happening, you get out of that kind of medley, you get the idea of capitalism. And so this was obviously a huge and fundamental change in the evolution of the West, this introduction of capitalism. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in a more detailed fashion here in a little bit. So the 19th century was also an age of science. By this term, we mean the belief that the universe obeyed rational laws, which could be found by observation and could be used to control it. And so, again, we run into the question of metaphysical categories. And of course, the Quigley's intention is not to deal with the philosophical issues that underlie these statements, but something of which I would always take note is that how do we, if the world and the universe obeys rational laws, which can be found by observation and can be used to control it, how do we justify that understanding? Why is it that man is made in a way that he can understand these things? And so this obviously leads towards a materialistic worldview. Eventually, this belief in science, the liberal capitalism, all of these things leave us with a worldview which sees matter as the ultimate and only truly existing reality. And materialism, of course, and we could talk about in another episode, but we can see kind of what I'm trying to get you to see is the flow of sentiment that gets us to where we are today in the 20th century. And so eventually we run into a serious change. And I'm going to summarize a little bit of what Quigley is talking about. He says, this change has arisen from a series of shattering experiences which have profoundly disturbed patterns of behavior and of belief of social organizations and human hopes. These shattering experiences, the chief of which was the trauma of the First World War, the long drawn-out agony of the World Depression, and the unprecedented violence of destruction of the Second World War. Of these three, the First World War was undoubtedly the most important. The First World War, with its millions of persons dead and its billions of dollars wasted, was a blow so terrible as to be beyond human ability to comprehend. As a matter of fact, no real success was achieved in comprehending it. The people of the day regarded it as a temporary and inexplicable aberration to be ended as soon as possible and forgotten as soon as ended. Accordingly, men were almost unanimous in 1919 in their determination to restore the world of 1913. This effort was a failure. After 10 years of effort to conceal the new reality of social life by a facade painted to look like 1913, the facts burst through the pretense and men were forced, willingly or not, to face the grim reality of the 20th century. The events which destroyed the pretty dream world of 1919 to 1929 were the stock market crash, the World Depression, the world financial crisis, and ultimately the martial clamor of rearmament and aggression. Thus, depression and war forced men to realize that the old world of the 19th century had passed forever, and made them seek to create a new world in accordance with the facts of present-day condition. The New World, this child of the period of 1914 to 1945, assumed its recognizable form only as the first half of the century drew to a close. And so you can see that the realization on behalf of the 19th century thinkers that man was capable of great evil, their response to that was that great evil can be prevented if society is allowed to have some sort of authoritarian influence on the individual. So you can see that we're now moving away from the laissez-faire, the idea that men can just be left to their own devices, men and women, and that the community of interest will just organically play itself out into a nice, neat, and tidy society where people are benevolent towards each other. This idea is cast away. Now, of course, you have to remember that we've divorced ourselves from a philosophically Christian worldview. And so there's not really any ultimate truth to anchor down and justify the beliefs that people have in the West. So materialism, secularism, faith in science, without God, without Christ, these things ultimately lead you to subjectivism, relativism, and in the worst cases, nihilism, and like actually some really desperately poor ways of thinking about the world. And so the view that evil is merely the absence of good has been replaced with the idea that evil is a very positive force which must be resisted and overcome. The horrors of Hitler's concentration camps and of Stalin's slave labor units are chiefly responsible for this change. So the old march of democracy now yields to the insidious advance of authoritarianism and the individual capitalism of the profit motive, seems about to be replaced by the state capitalism of the welfare economy. And so there's this really dramatic shift in the understanding of humans' place in the world as a result of the world wars. That's kind of the gist that we wanted to get to. So that's the introduction. Carroll Quigley lays down the philosophical current of ideas at the time that bring us into the early stages of capitalism, the effects of 2 world wars, depressions, the realization that humans are capable of this great evil, and in an organized and an intelligent way they can do terribly evil things. And so the response to that is, how can we organize society in a way that keeps this evil from happening again? That becomes kind of the purview. Now, if you go from the time that Carroll Quigley is talking about to now, you might be wondering, why is it that hasn't happened? Why is it that the West continues to be a dominating imperial force in the world, waging wars whenever they want, manipulating economies across the world? The Central Intelligence Agency is organizing coups in other countries. It's obvious to me when you read Carroll Quigley, he has this sense of being hypocritical in terms of his kind of utopian liberal worldview, where he thinks that genuinely that the Western powers are interested in spreading democracy throughout the world by means of negotiation and peacemaking. But when you look at the reality of the situation on the ground, you have this financial elite who is outright responsible for the governments of the West, and they are basically doing what they will with the money and the influence that they've obtained through history and through the banking system. And so there's a huge gap, I think, in Carroll Quigley's ability to reconcile these two ideas of this kind of rosy idea of Western democracy and liberalism, and then the reality of what actually appears on the ground. And keep in mind that Carroll Quigley is writing this book as a defense of those people that are organizing the Western powers. So we wouldn't expect for him to really give us anything like that idea, but it's something that we should keep in mind when we read the book. And so Western civilization to 1914 is where we're going to get into some of the details about how we get the world that we have today. And let's see, where can we start? He begins by talking about organization of power, and there's a lot of details on there that I'm going to skip because it honestly would be really boring. Now, there is kind of a flow of organization in society that goes from 670 all the way from 670 to 1934 to the present time. And he's really just highlighting this change in the way that authority is organized over time, the way society is organized at large. And in the 670s to about 1050, you have the manorial organization, which is the manors and your royal houses and things like that. You have commercial capitalism, which emerges after that from about 1050 to 1690. From 1770 to 1870, you have industrial capitalism. From 1850 to 1932, you have financial capitalism. From 1890 to 1950, you have monopoly capitalism. And then from 1934 to present, he calls the pluralist economy. And there's something very interesting about that they wanted to make note of, is that the people who manage each portion of this organization, the industrial capitalism was managed by owners of private firms. The financial capitalism was managed by bankers. The monopoly capitalism was managed by what he calls managers, which would basically be something like a CEO or the leader of a firm, hedge funds and stuff now. And the pluralist economy, which he says now, says it's managed by technocrats. And so in the future, we're going to be talking quite a bit about technocracy and what that means. And ultimately, Carroll Quigley believes that the future world government that the financial elite are trying to build upon the foundations that they've left here is going to be a technocratically organized government. And what that means is that experts, technology is really going to be the center and the direction in which people put their faith in the authority of the world. And it's interesting to me that he was writing about this in the 1950s. And so just something I wanted to point out, because we're going to be talking about that in the future. Now, he does make mention, which I found pretty interesting, about the failure of Marxism to accurately analyze and predict what would happen in the future. He says by 1900, social developments took a direction so different from that expected by Marx that his analysis became almost worthless, and his system had to be imposed by force in a most backward industrial country, Russia, instead of occurring inevitably in the most advanced industrial country as he had expected. So the social developments which made Marx's theories obsolete were the result of technological and economic developments which Marx had not foreseen. The energy for production was derived more and more from inanimate sources of power and less from human labor. As a result, mass production required less labor, but mass production required mass consumption, so that the products of the new technology had to be distributed to the working groups as well as to others, so that rising standards of living for the masses made the proletariat fewer and fewer and richer. So in some sense, there's a gist in Carroll Quigley's view that, well, let's see, how can we attack this? So there's this concept in geopolitics that's called the third way. And the third way is an acknowledgement of Western capitalism in the West and Eastern communist socialism in the East. And what the global elite want, they call the third way, which is in some sense like a Hegelian synthesis of the Western individuality, materialism, capitalism, and the Eastern community-oriented communistic socialism. And their goal has been, and this is in Zbigniew Brzezinski's books and a couple of the other texts that we'll be looking at in the future, their goal has been to create and allow these two political systems to operate in the world until they reach kind of their apex, and then have them collide, whether it be philosophically or even in terms of a war. And out of that synthesis to come the type of government that will be the foundations for the global government. And so this is called the third way. It's pretty interesting, but he makes a good amount of introduction into that idea here. And so we get into the rise of commercial capitalism, which, if you remember from the little list that we talked about before, is that the organization that appears after the manorial class. And this there's a couple things that I wanted to highlight in here, but we're gonna go pretty quickly through all of the kind of being too detail oriented in the history, because we have some really good information about the foundations of the banking system that I want to get to, and that's extremely relevant to our situation today. So this paragraph, he says, the way in which commercial capitalism, an expanding economic organization, was transformed into mercantilism, a restrictive economic organization, twice in our past history is very revealing, not only of the nature of economic systems and of men themselves, but also of the nature of economic crisis and what can be done about it. So you can see this method is still employed today, where the banking system as a whole will organize expansion and depression at times, and they will use the depression and the collapse of economies as a tactic of social engineering to introduce new policies and to create new sentiments for the things in which they'd like to apply. And so Carroll Quigley was onto this in the 1950s. He's writing pretty extensively about that. And then we're getting through now the change from commercial capitalism to industrial capitalism. And this is really where we get to the foundations of what we know of as banking today. And this is kind of the whole point that I wanted to highlight today, because I have a couple of slides that we're going to look at once we get through this that is going to show you how this system that Carroll Quigley describes has produced the world that we live in now. So this paragraph is really helpful. Hundreds of years ago, bankers began to specialize, with the richer and more influential ones associated increasingly with foreign trade and foreign exchange transactions. Since those were richer and more cosmopolitan and increasingly concerned with questions of political significance, such as stability and debasement of currencies, war and peace, dynastic marriages, and worldwide trading monopolies, they became the financiers and financial advisors of governments. Moreover, since their relationships with governments were always in monetary terms and not real terms, and since they were always obsessed with the stability of monetary exchanges between one country's money and another, they used their power and influence to do two things. One, to get all money and debts expressed in terms of a strictly limited commodity, ultimately gold, and two, to get all monetary matters out of the control of governments and political authority on the grounds that they would be handled better by private banking interests in terms of such a stable value as gold. And so it's in industrial capitalism that we have the introduction of the private banking system, right? And you would hear, if you look into the alternative right conservative media nowadays, people like Ron Paul and other individuals who have rightfully become aware of the situation in terms of how our money is created and how it operates, they over and over again will be calling for a gold standard. We need to go back to the gold standard. We need to go back to the gold standard. Now, the problem with that is that the system that we have now is basically the 2.0 version of what the gold standard was. So their solution to a banking problem is to return to a situation that the bankers had already engineered for themselves. So a return to a gold standard is not going to solve our monetary issues. It only brings us into an older system that was functionally the foundation to get to the system that we have now. Now, I'm not saying that it's not wise to point out that we were once on a gold standard, or that it's unwise to acknowledge the fact that having a private banking system responsible for creating our money is a bad idea. It is, genuinely. But I think that we need to look towards more effective solutions rather than trying to get back onto a gold standard, because matter of factly, the West is literally a paper tiger. We have really no tangible wealth as a nation anymore. And so the 100 years of manipulation on behalf of the financial elite in the United States has really left us with very little to do in terms of wealth. And it seems like everybody's really wealthy in the West, but the majority of that wealth is built up on credits and debts that can never really be paid back. So we're in an interesting situation in the West. But my point was just to say that the answer is not something like a gold standard again. If we were to do that, it would be utterly chaos in the West, and it would put a lot of people into poverty, and people would starve, and it would be bad. So I'm just saying that we need to think a little bit more creatively about solutions. So the introduction of industrial capitalism gets us even closer to the present context of how banking system works in our country. And we're just going to highlight a couple sentences of this section because I don't want to get too caught up in it. But there's one sentence here that really basically captures the gist. It says, financially, and this is in about 1790 to 1800, financially, England had discovered the secret of credit. Economically, England had embarked on the Industrial Revolution. So it's interesting to note that England comes into the Industrial Revolution quite a few years before the rest of the world. And so when you look back on this time period and you see the incredible role that Britain played in geopolitics, the reason for that is that they had already amassed an enormous amount of wealth in the years going into the Industrial Revolution early, prior to the rest of the nations that would end up following suit. And so this moment in time establishes England's presence in the geopolitical world for the future. And ultimately, without going into a whole bunch of detailed history, you could make the argument now that the West and America is, in a subtle way, actually just an extension of that original English and European empire. And we don't have to get too much into details. That would be for another episode. But he goes on to say, nevertheless, the founding of the Bank of England by William Patterson and his friends in 1694 is one of the great dates in world history. For generations, men had sought to avoid the one drawback of gold, its heaviness, by using pieces of paper to represent specific pieces of gold. Today, we call such pieces of paper gold certificates. Such a certificate entitles its bearer to exchange it for its piece of gold on demand, But in view of the convenience of paper, only a small fraction of certificate holders ever did make such demands. It early became clear that gold need be held on hand only to the amount needed to cover the fraction of certificates likely to be presented for payment. Accordingly, the rest of the gold could be used for business purposes, or what amounts to the same thing, a volume of certificates could be issued greater than the volume of gold reserved for payment of demands against them. Such an excess volume of paper claims against reserves we now call bank notes. Okay, so do you see the significance of what Carroll Quigley is explaining? The economic system that we have today is fundamentally built on this principle. And you could argue, I mean, even more extreme than it was back then, because having abandoned the gold standard, we now really have no tangible way to justify or explain how it is that we can create value. And this becomes really fundamental to understanding how the world works, because the credit system and the system of debt and currency is not something that you learn in school. And I always found that very interesting going through high school. Something that we use every day, like money, is like fundamental to our life. You need it to buy food, to buy shelter. But I never, ever had a time in school where someone explained to me what money was. Like, what is this thing that I'm using to buy the food that I need to stay alive? And there's a reason for that. I mean, the reason is that if people begin to understand what money is and how it works, they start to see through the cracks in the system of financial control that we're all living as subjects to. And so a lot of people, when I first began researching this topic, the history of banking and where it came from, you know, people would say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. You're just a conspiracy theorist. And here you have a mainstream academic establishment historian telling you that the creation of the bank in England was one of the most important events in history. And what was that event? The event was the creation of fractional reserve lending. They realized, hey, if we issue paper that's supposed to represent the amount of gold on demand, we can create more money than we actually have in gold. It's really not that hard to understand. And we still have that system in place today. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if you and your nepotistic friends can create money for each other, you can buy yourself political influence. And do you not think that that's what happened? Can you imagine that a company like BlackRock doesn't have political influence because of the amount of money that it has? It's a really simple concept, you know. So this whole idea that the left and the right of politics is the top of the power structure is absolutely insane. Once you understand how the financial system works, you can't continue thinking that the CEOs of American corporation, which we get as it's called a president, these people do not have the same level of influence. Neither does the Congress, neither does the Senate. Okay, so the American government is subject to these financial institutions, which ultimately loan them the money they need to survive. So the question should not be, do I vote conservative or liberal? The question should be, how can we reform this system as a whole? And I know that seems like a daunting task, but to be honest, there's not really another way to do it. Okay, because the longer we go on letting these criminal psychopaths create all our money for us, the longer we're going to be subject to the decisions that they make, you know. So we have to think a little bit more creatively about how the world is functioning. And Carroll Quigley is giving us some really good information here. He's saying that your banks own your government. It's very simple. It's not hard to understand. So we get into financial capitalism. Now, we went through commercial capitalism, we went through industrial capitalism. Now we're getting to financial capitalism. Now, this is the emergence of things like the stock exchange, the stock market as a whole, trading in foreign currencies and things like this. And we're getting a little bit closer even to where we're at today. So we're going to look at just a couple paragraphs here that I'm going to read. So, the men who did this, looking backward toward the period of dynastic monarchy in which they had their own roots, aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers, and were at least as successful at this as were many of the dynastic political rulers. The greatest of these dynasties, of course, were the descendants of Meyer Amschel Rothschild of Frankfurt, whose male descendants for at least 2 generations generally married first cousins or even nieces. Rothschild's 5 sons, established at branches in Vienna, London, Naples, and Paris, as well as Frankfurt, cooperated together in ways which other international banking dynasties copied but rarely excelled. So he goes on to say they were, especially in later generations, cosmopolitan rather than nationalistic. They were a constant, if weakening, influence for peace, a pattern established in 1830 and 1840 when the Rothschilds threw their whole tremendous influence successfully against European wars. So you can see that we're starting to build this framework of a relationship between finance and government. And what's happening is that the banking system is allowing for so much access to wealth on behalf of these families who are founding these banks in major cities throughout Europe, that they're availing themselves of the opportunity to ultimately control the governments in those areas, right? So we're not going to be just singling out the Rothschild family, although they did play a fundamental role. Now, I've had conversations with people where if you bring up the name Rothschild, you're tinfoil hat, conspiracy theorist, you're insane, you don't know anything you're talking about. This is a Harvard graduate, Georgetown professor that was a mentor to Bill Clinton that's telling you this is how it happened. This is historical fact. These families created the banking system as we know it today. So he goes on to name the other families that were involved sort of in the interaction between Europe and America. The names of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, Spires, Mirabeau, Mallet, Fould, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. So he points out some of their characteristics which are important for us to understand. He says they were cosmopolitan and international. Okay? Cosmopolitan means they cared more about cities that they lived in than they cared about the national policies of the place, right? So these are the kind of people that will have a place in New York, but they don't care about the United States. They don't care about democracy. They don't care about local politics. They care about their money. They care about their villa and their estate. And then they go to their other villa and estate in Sweden. They don't care about national boundaries. They're not concerned at all with patriotism. They're cosmopolitan and international. Okay. So this is forming the groundwork for what Carroll Quigley envisions will eventually be the world government. It's built out of people with this mindset. Okay. 2, they were close to governments and were particularly concerned with questions of government debts, including foreign government debts, even in areas which seemed at first glance poor risks like Egypt, Persia, Ottoman Turkey, Imperial China, and Latin America. Their interests were almost exclusively in bonds and very rarely in goods, since they admired liquidity and regarded commitments in commodities or even real estate as the first step toward bankruptcy. 4, they were accordingly fanatical devotees of deflation, which they called sound money from its close associations with high interest rates and a high value of money, and of the gold standard, which in their eyes symbolized and ensured these values. And 5, they were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers, and more particularly were known as merchant bankers in England, private bankers in France, and investment bankers in the US. In all countries, they carried on various kinds of banking and exchange activities, but everywhere they were sharply distinguishable from other more obvious kinds of banks, such as savings banks or commercial banks. Okay, so this system of banking is the foundation for the world as we know it today. Financial capitalism, what Carroll Quigley calls financial capitalism, is the political system that we now have. The left versus right, the Congress, the Senate, that is all just a facade on the surface of what actually exists in the center, which is this concerted international control of monetary policy that dictates at a very fundamental level the ways in which government is carried out, both in Europe, in the United States, in China, and Russia, and all of these places. So there's a couple things that we have to take note of, because Carroll Quigley is going to describe to us how it is that the banking system ended up exercising so much power over government. The influence of financial capitalism and of the international bankers who created it was exercised both on business and on governments, but could have done neither if it had not been able to persuade both these to accept two axioms of its own ideology. Both of these were based on the assumption that politicians were too weak and too subject to temporary popular pressures to be trusted with control of the money system. Accordingly, the sanctity of all values and the soundness of money must be protected in two ways: by basing the value of money on gold and by allowing bankers to control the supply of money. Now listen to this. To do this, it was necessary to conceal or even to mislead both governments and people about the nature of money and its methods of operation. Okay, so Carroll Quigley is telling us very matter-of-factly that the financial manipulation of the public was carried out intentionally. It's done on purpose, and it's done with the sole intention of allowing private banking institutions to have total responsibility for the creation and the execution of money. Okay. So the next step we have in domestic financial practices is the emergence of what is now called the central bank. And there's just one more paragraph and then we're going to move on. There were formerly many banks of issue, but this function is now generally restricted to a few or even to a single central bank in each country. Such banks, even central banks, were private institutions owned by shareholders who profited by their operations. In the 1914 to 1939 period in the United States, Federal Reserve notes, what we call money today, were covered by gold certificates to 40% of their value, but this was reduced to 25% in 1945. The Bank of England, by an act of 1928, had its notes uncovered up to 250 million pounds and covered by gold for 100% value over that amount. The Bank of France in the same year set its note cover at 35%. These provisions could always be set aside or changed in an emergency, such as war. So he goes on to describe the function of the gold and relationship to currency as an inverted pyramid, where the people at the point of the pyramid where money is created have less access to wealth compared to those who are at the top of the pyramid, farther away from the point. And he goes on to say, which I thought this was interesting, he says this to a considerable extent. So in the United States, deposits were traditionally limited to 10 times reserves of notes in gold. In Britain, it was usually near 20 times such reserves. In all countries, the demand for and volume of such credit was larger in time of a boom and less in time of a depression. This, to a considerable extent, explains the inflationary aspect of a depression, the combination helping to form the so-called business cycle. All right. So what's Carroll Quigley saying there? He's telling us that through the manipulation of money supply, the central banks and the international banks at large can engineer and create both inflation and deflation, which translates to either depression or expansion of the economy. Okay, so all of these recessions and depressions, these things, they do not happen by accident. It's very, very intimately and fundamentally controlled. The whole process of money creation is something that is taken with scientific severity. Okay, so it's not, things don't just happen in the economy and it's like, oh my goodness, the job numbers are down, who would have seen that coming? No, that's not how it happens. The central banks have perfect and utter control over the expansion and contraction of the money supply, and there obviously are some unexpected contingencies that happen in terms of where money gets spent or where it ends up. But overall, it is possible for us to have an efficient economy where labor is rewarded with proper value, where the price of goods is stable. And I'm saying this to make it clear to you that the system we have now is not the way it has to be. It's not just like out of people's hands and it just ended up this way. And now, God forbid, what do we do? That's not what's happening. What's happening is a systematic and intentional agenda to devalue the value of our money. Okay. And when this happens, people become more poor. The rich who have access to money creation become more wealthy, right? And eventually you can break down civilization in the West and force it into a situation where it has to participate in a global government in order to stay alive. Now, this has been done to other countries all throughout history. The only thing different is that it's happening in the West now. In America, that seems shocking. In places like Venezuela, in places like Argentina and Uruguay, places where this has happened before, this is nothing new, right? And something similar is happening in Ukraine. So there's a couple quotes from historical figures that I just wanted to drill home the point that this whole idea of banks running the government is not some type of loony tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Okay, this is in 1852, Gladstone, Chancellor of the Exchequer, declared the hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned. On September 26, 1921, the Financial Times wrote, half a dozen men at the top of the big five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills. Okay. In 1924, Sir Drummond Fraser, vice president of the Institute of Bankers, stated, the governor of the Bank of England must be the autocrat who dictates the terms upon which alone the government can obtain borrowed money. Okay. So there's no question about the influence that international banks have on the government. And that's very important for us to understand our present situation. Okay. So what happens now? We get to our present situation. We have, how does the government work? This is the question that we want to answer. And we're going to get into more detail about think tanks and about these groups that are filled with people in the government, but are mysteriously not part of the government. Groups like the Round Table that Cecil Rhodes started, the Trilateral Commission, and you have like the Beberg group. I don't want to say the whole word because the video will get throttled on the algorithm. But you have these what they call think tanks and different organizational structures. The World Economic Forum is a good example. These are the places where truly decisions are being made. Okay, so if you want to understand the geopolitical situation, you're not going to be looking to a president, a congressman, a senator. They do play a role in some sense, but ultimately the agenda that's being carried out at the level of geopolitics, at the international level, is ultimately decided by these groups of people that are supra-governmental. Okay, so the people of the Trilateral Commission, the people of the Council on Foreign Relations, of which Mr. Quigley was a member, they are the ones that are ultimately guiding the direction of domestic and foreign policy in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, okay, and South America too. So these international companies and the people who own the companies, especially the investment banks, hedge funds, you know, you think of people like Larry Fink at BlackRock. These companies are ultimately the people who are making decisions about what the world does next. It's really not domestic governments that are doing this anymore. And we've been given the story of international governments as a window dressing for what is really occurring. And I'm not trying to be a doomer, and I'm not trying to make the point that, you know, black pilled and that everybody, there's no difference that we can make. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that in order for us to understand geopolitics, we have to take seriously what people like Carroll Quigley are telling us. And that is, there is a supra government, right, that has more influence than what we normally believe our government to have, right? So when, for instance, you see, I'm going to show you guys a couple pictures that I think will be helpful in understanding how this whole situation works, okay? So we're going to take that down a little bit. I hope that works. And this is a very simple diagram, okay? You have the Round Table Group, you have the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations, Bilderberg Group, Club of Rome, Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, okay? And then at the center of all these groups, there's what they call the Round Table. Now, this is not conspiracy theory. This is not, it shouldn't be news to anybody. but it is the way that the world works. So if you're looking at something like this, you can see that the governments play some role, but not much. Okay, so the government is ultimately subservient to these international bodies of the real government of the world. Okay, so if you haven't heard of the Council on Foreign Relations, if you haven't heard of the United Nations, which I'm guessing you probably would have, the Bilderberg Group in recent times has become pretty popular because of people like Alex Jones. The Club of Rome is one that's not often discussed. The Royal Institute of International Affairs is often not discussed, and the Trilateral Commission is often not discussed. So these are the groups and the bodies of politics that generally make decisions. Now, you might be asking yourself, why haven't you been told about this? Well, the reason you haven't been told about this is in this picture here. This is the American empire and its media. You have the Council on Foreign Relations, you have the Bilderberg meetings, and you have the Trilateral Commission. And you can see the way that they interconnect. These are all the CEOs and different pundits that are participating in them all. Now, you can see that both ends of the political spectrum are participating in the organization of government, right? So you have CNN right here, right? Oh, but here's Fox News. Okay. So you have to take a step back and see things for what they really are. And now, don't forget, we have all of the technological giants on this side. Now, this is an older version. You can get newer copies of these, and you can take a look at them at your own time. But I just wanted you to see those diagrams are what the real government is now. These are all unelected people that are making the decisions that affect my life and your life on a daily basis. And I wanted to end by saying the proper response. Oh, I'm just seeing the messages there, Richard. Yeah, government digital currency, that's probably likely. This is all playing out on the stage that is the war in Ukraine, sure. Yeah, I'm planning on doing an episode, Richard, about the Ukraine situation. I have like 10 or 11 pages of notes that I've taken and trying to go back into 2014 when the intelligence agencies organized the coup. And so I'm going to do a good deep dive into the situation in Ukraine, and we're going to be talking about BRICS and, Russia and its relationship to the West. But interestingly enough, Carroll Quigley mentions in this book that actually the very next chapter, the third chapter, is all about the development of Russia. And ultimately, Carroll Quigley, in writing this book, really set the stage for the Cold War. And the reason is that the globalist worldview, they really see Russia as a major threat because they sense, and I think rightfully so, that Russia, especially in more recent times, has really been trying to commit itself to its traditional values. And they don't really want in Russia the imported Western liberalism that the global elite are so fond of spreading throughout the world, because it's not just democracy that they spread. You also get, you get the Skittles and the transgender stuff, and you get all of this with it, So a lot of countries are starting to say, well, maybe we don't want to keep doing this global thing that the West is imposing on the rest of the world. And Russia has always been a target for the global elite because really, well, I guess you could make the argument that Carroll Quigley is ultimately describing an attempt on the West to subjugate and weaken Germany and Russia. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire were the two empires that Britain ultimately were facing at the time. And this tension, which we see now playing out in Ukraine, still exists today. And that's another reason why this book is so helpful in helping us understand our present context, is because all of this excitement and fear and paranoia about Russia it's an attempt at social engineering, a hatred for a country that just really wants to be left alone by the West and stick to its traditional values. And so we'll get into that. That's a whole other story. But yeah, that is true, Richard. That's true for sure. But ultimately, I I have a couple more quotes from Carroll Quigley that are further on in the book that I couldn't get to tonight, but that were relevant because of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So, the chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and more international. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea, acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. The policies that are vital and necessary for America are no longer subjects of significant disagreement, but are disputable only in terms of procedure, priority, and method. Do you see what Carroll Quigley is saying there? He's saying that the influential bankers of the world have organized the political system in the West so that no matter who you elect, their agenda is accomplished. Right? Do you see that that's what he's saying? The policies that are vital and necessary for America are no longer subjects of significant disagreement, but are disputable only in terms of procedure, priority, and method. All right. So no matter if you elect Donald Trump or if you elect Joe Biden, if you elect Obama, if you elect George Bush, you still get Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum. There's no avoiding it, right? This myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, which you saw in the last diagram, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its paper and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims and have, for much of my life, been close to it and to many of its instruments. I have objected, both in the past and recently, to a few of its policies, notably to its belief that England was an Atlantic rather than a European power and must be allied or even federated with the United States and must remain isolated from Europe. But in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. So you can see, Carroll Quigley is not pulling any punches. He's simply explaining to you that there does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network, which operates in the scenes. It's a shadow government. It's undeniably the case, and Carroll Quigley was not ashamed to talk about it. And ultimately, he says the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the whole world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the systems was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. Okay? So that's what's going to be the case. Carroll Quigley lays it out for you. There's no, it's not just that it's a conspiracy theory. It's not just that it's tinfoil hat stuff. It's just genuinely the fact that we are dealing with an international force, a power that comes from Europe that has manipulated into existence the central banks of the world in order to centralize them and to further their ability to influence world politics. Okay. And so I do believe in some possible solutions to these problems, which we'll talk about in another episode. But I don't want to leave you all doomy and gloomy. I do have hope for the future. I believe in the resiliency of humans. I believe in our creativity, and especially in our commitment to God and the influence of the Holy Spirit on individual humans to work together and solve these problems. And I do ultimately believe that good overcomes evil. And I believe that we stand a chance to make positive impacts on the future. And I think that we have a lot of options now. things like cryptocurrency, not central bank digital currencies, offer us a way to exchange value, which separates us from the influence of these international banks. It is possible for you to exchange value with somebody using the internet, where you don't have to use gold, you don't have to use dollars, you don't have to use the Federal Reserve. And so there are ways in which we can make a difference. And I want to encourage you to explore those options, to look into different ways in which you could be contributing to crafting a positive future. I think that education is our fundamental problem right now. I think more people need to at least develop the interest to become aware of how the world works. And that's why I'm doing this here. So I hope that you learn some things. I hope that the history isn't a little bit too slow for you. I know it can be kind of monotonous and a little detail oriented, but yes, I pray that it was helpful, and I appreciate you being here. Next week, we're going to be doing some theology next week. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I hope you can come tune in. It'll be at the same time next Sunday at 9:30 at night EST. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the week. And doing some theology next week. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I hope you can come tune in. It'll be at the same time next Sunday at 9:30 at night EST. And I hope that you